to another edition of Surgeons' Lives. I'm your host, John Monson. You're not going to want to miss this interview because it's really quite extraordinary. Dr. Vivian McAlister is on the one level, a recently retired liver transplant surgeon from London, Ontario. Irish by background, his pathway to becoming a stalwart of the transplant community in Canada was unusual, to say the least. However, he indeed was a huge success, but that's nothing to what he then started to do when he was a mere 51 years of age. He became involved in the Canadian Royal Forces and developed a second career, if you like, in military surgery, having been deployed multiple times to Kandahar, where he developed extraordinary skills and experience in catastrophe surgery, trauma surgery, obviously, and training individuals in this specialty. He's recently become an adjunct professor in the Department of History in the university and is moving on to a more thoughtful rather than action-laden phase of his career. Honors and awards have come his way. They are many and varied, including honorary fellowship at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. He has been president of the James IV Association of Surgeons, and in 2021 became an officer of the Order of Canada, an extraordinary recognition for his contributions to not just Canada, but surgery. So don't miss this interview. It's essentially a full hour. The first half is about his transplant life, and the second half approximately is his military career. I hope you enjoy it. My name is John Monson, and this is Surgeons' Lives. Thank you, Vivian, for joining today. So what I normally ask people to do, and I will ask you to do as well, is to start us off by a brief life journey resume, starting with the words, "I was born in."
I was born in a nursing home in Dublin. In those days, ladies would go to these old houses and have their babies with the help of nurses. And I don't actually know which one. I don't think you wanted that sort of detail, but things changed a lot after.
Well, I can tell you, Vivian, that I myself was born in the Hatch Street nursing home in Dublin. Exactly the same story that you're saying.
Yes, yeah. And going by our age, our parents, our mothers were probably there around the same time. But it was a different time. I grew up in a very privileged situation, really. My father's a dentist, and we never wanted for anything. But education was prized in our house. My grandfather was a doctor, and the other grandfather was an army man. So we had nothing to give the children except their education. And I was fortunate to have a really privileged education where my friends, the friends that I made then, remain my friends today. And this continued in Trinity, where we both did medicine. And I think you'll attest to the fact that our class remains very, very friendly on personal terms, as well as having shared a lot of professional experiences. And I think that set the tenor for my life, to be quite honest, that I've always worked with people. I've always tried to get on with people, and I've enjoyed their company. So in all the tasks that I did, it was always in the company of others and feeding off the expertise of others and learning from them and hoping not to disgrace myself, really. I spent my entire life trying to avoid making errors or stupid mistakes that I would regret later. And I think, by and large, I think I did, but I did my best. Now, after Trinity, I did the usual house jobs that we did, internship first, and then the 6 monthly jobs as senior house officer, as we were called. And it was clear to me that I'd have to get into practice relatively soon. And I chose family medicine first. And after doing a few locums in Ireland, I actually emigrated to Canada where the jobs were better. And I ended up in northern Saskatchewan, very north, actually, north of Lake Athabasca in a town called Uranium City. And it was clear what that town did. But it was a small town with an indigenous population and a mining community. And I really enjoyed it there. I had to hide the name of the town from my wife, or she wouldn't have accompanied me there. But having got there, we actually had a wonderful year. It was out in the wilds where we began to enjoy nature as well as the job. And the job forced you to innovate because you were, out in the boonies and you didn't have the same support that you would have in the city. And with other doctors who were there, I was part of a team of doctors. We managed to provide excellent service, I think. And another aspect of my life that started then is I flew every week about 100 miles or more in small planes to various reserves where we provided medical clinics. And then I took patients home and we looked after them in the hospital in Uranium City and then brought them back. But it also gave me an insight into life in First Nations communities up north. I got to know these communities very, very well. They expected me every week and they welcomed me. It was a wonderful experience. And I think that also set a tenor for me.
So I'm guessing that you were in, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were in northern Saskatchewan in this area as part of the immigration deal, etc., to an underserved.
Well, there's no deal, John.
No?
Actually, it was very generous in Canada. You didn't have to sign up. It was that the job was available.
Okay.
And in actual fact, the only reason I ended up there was I was a very faithful attender at the hospital library when the British Medical Journal used to come in. And the librarian thought I was very studious, but in fact, all I did was flick it to the back to look at the overseas jobs. And it was one of those that I went to.
So at this stage, you were still a family practitioner, albeit in a very different environment.
General practitioner, I think we'd call it.
Yeah.
Really.
But
we did look after families, but we never paid much attention to that notion. It was really just looking after the nuts and bolts of healthcare.
Was your mind? I mean, were you in being a general practitioner as a frustrated surgeon, or had it ever crossed your mind at this point?
Well, no, I would have chosen surgery if there was a clear path available to us in Dublin. So I did enjoy the kind of technical side of, I suppose, care, but it wasn't really just the hands-on stuff. It was actually, and I discovered that much later, it was decision-making. Surgery is really about decision-making, and you have to commit at a certain stage to a diagnosis and to a line of treatment. That what they needed up north was somebody who would just make undertake the kind of what was necessary for health to be maintained. So it wasn't really as much a social side of things. It was really they were very particular about just getting what they needed for care. They had other means of looking after themselves socially.
And how long were you there?
I spent a year there. And actually, what happened in the midst of my year, they closed the mine, and that would paid to that. If it was something that had gone on a long time, I actually enjoyed it so much. I think I'd nearly be there today.
Right. Right.
But they reduced the size of the medical component, and I
Yeah.
was the last doctor in, so the first doctor out. And then we moved to southern Saskatchewan, to another small town, but on the prairie, with a very different type of requirement. I did actually have, as a solo doctor in a town, a hospital with an operating room. I used to do deliveries there, and I had 8 beds in the hospital.
Wow.
And that terrified me. Doing deliveries
Yeah.
for patients without having surgical backup
Yes.
was really, really worrisome. I made a deal with a neighboring doctor who was a surgeon, that if I got in trouble, he would come to the town, and because I didn't even have an ambulance in those days. It was quite extraordinary that we had healthcare in the 1980s that was very much the same as healthcare in the 1900s.
Now, when you were in Dublin, you were, as you said earlier, flicking through the back pages of the BMJ, looking through the situations vacant section. And were you still doing that now in Saskatchewan, for this? Because where your career, I was going to say ended. It was a very bad word, but where your career culminated, it could not have been further in terms of from a single-handed doc in Saskatchewan to part of a transplant team. I mean, it is the opposite ends, polar opposites, I think it'd be
Polar opposites.
yeah.
And I've told all of students that I've mentored, never worry about your CV. When you look at your CV in retrospect, it all looks like it was planned. And it was the perfect plan, a very unusual but perfect plan. Because actually, when I got to transplantation, there was nothing that was more important to a surgeon than to be a very broad-minded surgeon. You were hit with things from all sorts of directions that you'd never expect. Infections that nobody had heard of in either the Western world or hadn't heard of for 50 years. And these were turning up in transplant patients, and very unusual surgical situations and things where you had to innovate. So to have a background in austere circumstances is actually perfect training for a transplant surgeon. But that was all in the future, and certainly not my plan. My career happened by happenstance as much as anything else. Although I made decisions and took choices.
Yeah.
Determined.
So what was the break point where you decided to take surgery seriously?
So it was actually a tragic occurrence. My young brother, 21 years old, was a student in the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, medical student, and he died in a car accident.
Oh, goodness.
So we had been in Canada for a few years at that stage. My mother had also died young. So my father was on his own, and my brothers and sisters were at home. And I felt we should make a break and come home for a while. Our children were also at an age where if they were to experience growing up in Ireland, and it was such a nice experience for myself and my wife, Christiane, that we felt they would really enjoy that opportunity. So we took this opportunity to take a break in the career and go back. And then going back, I didn't really know what to do, because it's not easy to switch as a family doctor from Canada to a practice in Ireland. The job situation was just as bad then. Yeah. And I really didn't relish the idea of getting stuck in doing locums or something like that. So I actually took an opportunity to renew an acquaintance with a surgeon, Brian Hargan, who had been registrar in Sir Patrick Dunn's when I was an intern, and who actually had taught me a lot of surgery as a young student, to become his, I think I don't forgot now, must have been a senior house officer again, when he was a surgeon in Naas.
Right.
So I did that one for a year with Brian and Graham Fry, who was also a surgeon with a very interesting background,
Yes.
who had done surgery in Africa and was doing neurosurgery in Dublin, and then did general surgery, and then finally left the surgery field altogether. But a very interesting person and terrific.
Yes, I knew Graham and his brother Ed, and Graham, of course, went into tropical medicine.
Yep.
That
Which I
was
think he still does. Yeah.
yeah. So at this stage, you know, you'd followed a non-traditional pathway for all sorts of
Absolutely. Yeah.
reasons, and would have you know, perceived, as you say, in retrospect, it's all a master plan, a cunning plan that you put together. But at the time, you would have been, you know, perceived as being behind your, you know, contemporaries in terms of pathway. Did that stress you at all, or were you?
No, I enjoyed that very much. So at that stage, I made the commitment. Let's get our surgery training one way or another, and get the exams and return to Canada maybe after 3 or 4 years. That was the plan, if I made any plan at all. And I had to complete the surgery exams in Dublin. So there's the primary surgery exam, and I'm not sure if they still do it, but it was a very difficult exam, as you remember. It involved anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, the basic sciences, and examined to a high degree with a large failure rate. So I enrolled in a course at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, which was taken in the evenings and in the weekends, to study for this. And as you say, I was about maybe 3 or 4 years older than the others in the course. But I enjoyed their company tremendously, and we were a great study group. They gave me the opportunity to pass that exam easily. The other thing I discovered was that the rules in the College of Surgeons in Ireland were still very old-fashioned. So I actually qualified by experience to do the final exam as well, if I had the primary. So I was in the office there, and I said, I'm going to apply for both. And I've forgotten the name of the lady. It was a lovely lady at the office, and she said, well, now look, Dr. McAlister, there is one problem. And I said, well, what's that? Well, we're not giving you the feedback if you fail the primary. Oh, I've forgotten what the fee was, about £50 or something. It was wonderful. So I said, that's a chance I'm going to take. And I actually did both exams in the one sitting, and suddenly found myself with the FRCSI and applied for, I was in the applications for junior registrar jobs.
So it almost in one fell swoop, you'd almost caught up those 3 years you were missing.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, as you say, it was all a master plan. So then you went back to Canada?
No, not quite. So as a junior registrar, I did various jobs in Dublin, all wonderful jobs, and giving me experience in areas that were all being developed. So in St. James's, I did colorectal surgery. I spent a long time. I was very bad at research, but I spent days and days doing anorectal manometry, which was brand new in those days. And one of the things in Ireland, which is people may not understand, but condoms were very hard to get. And we for some reason use these for the pressure monitoring, and we used to send the most junior of the thing to the chemist, as it was called, to buy the condoms. And on one occasion, I was doing manometry, and the condom came loose, and I left it in the patient's rectum. And I explained it to her, and she said, "Oh my God." She wouldn't leave unless I retrieved it. So we didn't have a sigmoidoscope in the lab. I had to go and get the sigmoidoscope and finally take the thing out for her.
You
But
survived, and she
I
survived.
survived, and I learned a lot doing that. I then went and I did some vascular surgery with Vincent Keaveney and and Dennis Megan, and I thought, oh well, that's good. I think I like vascular. I'll try that. And I was rescued from that by Niall O'Higgins, who was the professor of surgery. And Niall has a special personality. He's an excellent teacher, but for some reason he didn't have a registrar for the upcoming session, and he asked if I would do it. And I was also asked to be the tutor for St. Vincent's Hospital, UCD medical students. And so I did those two jobs for maybe 18 months. And in the process, it changed my career completely. So instead of becoming a general surgeon that would go back to become in Canada became known as a community surgeon, I would became kind of an academic surgeon, and I did transplantation.
So did you effectively start your transplantation training when you went back to Canada, or did you start it in Ireland?
So in Ireland, we were starting transplantation.
Yes.
It was very early. And the first operations, I was like a junior on the team. And I had some experience of that. We had two teams. One would go for the donor, and then we were doing the recipient at the same time. And they were very, very difficult experiences. And a lot of people just couldn't hack it. But for me, my first transplants were actually done in Dublin.
Right.
But I was very, very junior on the team. But I learned an awful lot from that. No, my transplant training was in London, Ontario, under Bill Wall, and that was a formal transplant fellowship as well as liver surgery. I did kidney transplant as well during those 2
So
years.
you went back to
Yes.
to
I came back to
London.
Canada, and it served two purposes. One, it was an entree back into the surgery community in Canada. I also qualified for the with my training to date, my FRCSI plus the years as a registrar for the Canadian exams, which were exit exams. So I did those in the first few months I went back, did my transplant fellowship, and as you say, I caught up. I now had basic general surgery training, specialist surgery training, my fellowships, and I put the train back on the regular track.
And you essentially spent the rest of your career in organ transplantation in London.
Yeah. So, but in Canada, the transplant team are also integral to the general surgery service. So there was very few transplant only surgeons. I mean, virtually all of us were general surgeons as well. We were doing a lot of general surgery on call, as well as doing specialist liver surgery. And we became known as the surgeons to go to if you're in trouble. So we would be doing the rescue surgeries as well. And so that became a pattern for all general surgeons, all transplant general surgeons in Canada. And I was in that. I went from London to Halifax, and I was looking after transplantation there as part of a smaller team, but we were very important because we not only looked after the people of Nova Scotia, but we also looked after the other three Atlantic provinces. So I had this experience of being a referral surgeon from 4 provinces.
Wow.
And I learned to deal with 4 different governments. And that gave me another little bit of experience that just using some Irish bravado, I was able to do. I'll give you an example. When tacrolimus became available, it was FK507, it was called. It wasn't available in Canada. It was only a research medication, but it was instead of cyclosporin. Now, cyclosporin had been brought in, and it was actually being available free under a special program for transplant patients, and it requires you to measure the level of the drug. Well, tacrolimus is very similar, and it also required these. It required subsidy, and I had to get tests done. So I arranged with the lab, and the lab said to me, "Well, how am I going to get paid for this?" And even though we have a national health system, they're paid for individual tests and things. And I said, "Well, how are you paid for cyclosporin?" And he said, "Well, it's." He gave a number that was associated with that test. So what I did was called up first Prince Edward Island and asked for the Minister of Health, put straight through and was chatting to him and said, "Look, I've got a new drug I really need it for your patients. I want you just to change line 00 whatever to cyclosporin or tacrolimus." And he said, "Oh, righto." He did that. Then I called Newfoundland and they did it. Then I knew New Brunswick, for some reason, always my heart province. I went back to Nova Scotia. They did it. And then I went to New Brunswick and I said, "Your patients are coming home on tacrolimus. So you'll need to change this." And he said, "Beg your pardon?" And I said, "Well, if you have any trouble, just ask your counterparts in any of the other provinces." So overnight, I got it registered in 4 provinces. And it took another 3 years before Ontario would do it.
Wow. Yeah.
So
A man
we were
of
way
great
ahead of
power. A man of great power. Now, you mentioned earlier on, Vivian, that your granddad was a doc, and your I think it was an uncle was in the army.
My other grandfather was.
Your other grandfather was in the army, and the other. Apart from a stellar career in organ transplantation and contributing, very significantly to healthcare in Canada, you've had this other string to your bow, which, for such a mild-mannered, softly spoken individual, would perhaps seem surprising to the casual observer. Do you want to tell us that story?
Well, in Nova Scotia, there's a Navy base, Army bases, and it's very important in the Canadian Armed Forces, in the Eastern Command and the Atlantic Command. And we had quite a few doctors on faculty who were also in the armed forces. And we also trained residents. So I trained many residents who were in the armed forces. And I became familiar with them. I was also conscious of history. So I knew about Canada's history. I knew about our own history in Ireland and through my own grandfather, etc. And I also, as I described earlier, surgeons, I found how surgeons played a very important role in society, that they weren't just your technical health restorer. Actually, there's a different, an important role that we play as members of the community. And I had this feeling that, I've been given great opportunities, great privilege, and that, at some stage I might have to pay it back. And that was definitely the history of world wars and things like that. But very fortunately for me, in the 1990s, there was really no wars or anything that we would be asked to contribute to. But that all changed with 9/11 and with then the wars, I suppose, on terrorism, uh, or whatever they're going to be called in the future. And Canadian soldiers started to die in Afghanistan, which was the first time that this had really happened since the Korean War. Although we had occasional deaths on deployment, never under the same situations that they were facing in Afghanistan. And my ex-residents were in the armed forces and were deploying over there. And actually, one resident who was a medical student with me first, actually did some sort of project in the lab and then went on and did anesthesia, was over there, and he gave a talk. And here is this experience of having a young person give a talk about doing very, very difficult things overseas. And it was one of these after dinner talks, and a few glasses of red wine in had liberated my thoughts. And I got up and said, you know, chaps, we shouldn't be sending the young people over to face this, that if anything, we should be going, and if any mines are to be destroyed, it should be ours, because really we've had a good go of it. And I said that, but I really didn't think it through. And at the end of the talk, he said, well, do you want to go?
And
I didn't think it was an
what
option.
age were you then, Vivian?
I was 51.
Right. So too old enough to know better, you know.
Old enough to know better, but I actually did mean what I said.
Yeah.
And I did deploy then as an augmentative surgeon as a civilian in 2007. And having gone over there, and I was in Kandahar, on the Kandahar airfield in the hospital there, and looking after patients that I had never dreamt would I'd ever have to look after. I decided to join the team. I did have a lot of experience. Prior to that, there was one of my residents said he didn't want to go to the military hospital because they were doing virtually nothing there. That was in the 1990s. And he said, could I stay with you for a fellowship? And I had said to him, well, I don't think the Army wants transplant surgeons. So we can't make it a transplant fellowship.
Yeah.
So how about and I'm not a trauma surgeon, so we won't dare call it trauma surgery. So we changed the fellowship and we called it catastrophe surgery. So catastrophe, I invented the whole field of catastrophe surgery for this chap. And we decided the definition was either looking after a lot of patients who suffer injuries in a catastrophe, or looking after one patient with catastrophic injuries. And I said, the only thing you've to tell, you must promise me, is that when you talk to them about your fellowship, I mean, he did a lot of very good surgery. He did donor surgeries, transplant surgeries, looking at it from the perspective of a general surgeon. I said, is that you're not allowed to tell them that we have created most of the catastrophes that you have fixed.
From a purely educational perspective, of course.
Yeah.
So I do remember seeing the front of your laptop one day with a talk that I've never forgotten, the title of the talk, which was Do-It-Yourself Neurosurgery, which I think, reflected the fact. I think you told me at the time that it was just you and an orthopedic surgeon found yourself having to do everything. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the dentist. Actually, the dentist was also very helpful. The three of us could cover eye injuries. I did what I call superficial neurosurgery. So I stayed on the surface of the brain. And the hardest part I found of neurosurgery is the craniotomy. And luckily, the Taliban had done the craniotomy on a lot of the patients already. So it wasn't as difficult as it looked. It was basically superficial cleanup and try and stop bleeding, things like that.
And it's a silly question because it doesn't get answered in a simple sentence to answer. But can you try and give me some senses on your multiple deployments over numerous years? What did you learn from that?
Oh, it changed me completely. First of all, your whole life priorities change, and life's short, life's cheap, so enjoy it, and make sure that those around you are enjoying their lives too. Um, it was clear difference between my lifestyle at home and the life of the people in Afghanistan. I got to know them very well. My experience up north in Saskatchewan in Canada with First Nations people and reserves was very useful in trying to adjust to their way of thinking and understanding things from their perspective. So there was that. All the way I did surgery changed too. I did an awful lot of repeat surgeries because we at that stage thought of, we even had a metric that returning to the operating room was considered an error.
Mm-hmm.
And over there, I did it on purpose. I would do temporary surgery, put them away, and come back later because we had too many to do in one go. And it became known as resuscitation surgery. I've forgotten now what we called it. But the whole plan of that, I then started to use it in general surgery a lot as well. I did things like, and when I was doing things like that, I wouldn't pack the abdomen as we still do. I don't like leaving the abdomen wide open and putting vac dressings on and then constantly doing that. And then you have this dreadful situation where you just can't close the abdomen easily at all. I would close the skin and just leave it like that. Sometimes with obviously with drains if it's going to be wet, and bring them back in 48 hours, something like that. And snip the stitches and off we go. And I use techniques anyway that I had developed there. We used to close skin with Vicryl, which was, again, not something that was thought wise at home. But the reason it came out was the Dutch surgeon. He said, "Oh, we do this to all the drug addicts because they never come back for their stitches." So,
yeah,
and it turned out I did this for Afghan patients, and some of them did come back, and the wounds were brilliant. I couldn't believe it. Occasionally there was a little thread still there, and I just give a rub, and the thread falls out because it had dissolved. But so anyway, I learned techniques, I suppose, and I learned life stories, life lessons.
So one of the interviews I've done in this channel was with a surgeon who, in the space of 2 or 3 years, had about 3 significant brushes with his own mortality. Major heart event and cancer and one thing or another, and in a short time frame, it very much moved him to use phrases that you've just used. That life is short, and to focus on the positive things in life and how you're blessed, and not be stressed about conflict and issues, and just leave that side of your life aside. It redefines priorities, and it's almost your description is almost the same. Luckily, you didn't suffer, the personal brushes with mortality, although nominally, of course, being deployed is exactly that. But But if you take what I'm saying, in that it was
I was never injured, thankfully.
yeah, I mean, it was a life-defining area. I mean, a period for you that really redefined you.
But, I've just brought all of the experience that we all have prior to that to bear. To some extent, I think it just makes things more acute. It makes you brings them together, so you have to reflect and make decisions.
So,
But we're not different.
so
We would all probably be the same.
if I was to ask you, how you would advise or guide young trainees who don't, thankfully hopefully would not have to face personal health brushes with mortality to make them open their eyes or go to conflicts around the world to do that. But how would you advise them and guide them, bringing your wisdom or pearls or advice to their managing their life as because part of this, it seems to me, speaks to the issue of burnout and stress that's going on. And the thing that I hear talking to you and my previous interview is that stress no longer features as a major feature as a consequence of those life experiences. Is that a fair comment?
No, well, stress. There's different forms of stress,
Yes. Mm.
and I mean, there was part of my career where I was really just going from one battle to the next. I mean, one operation to the next, hoping to succeed and ready to fail at any second. And it was very stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe I would be able to handle that sort of thing a little more differently. Now, there are some advantages on deployment. So we operated a lot. We operated on very sick and very badly injured people. We were working in circumstances where a lot of people were very underprivileged, and you would look after them and know that they would leave your place and go to a really rotten situation. And that would provide a lot of stress. But the, there were two things. One is I looked after myself. So we didn't have anything to do except eat, sleep, work.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually is very relaxing. So occasionally, if I was going through a bad patch here with an awful lot of work, I would go in the same mode and say look, go enjoy yourselves to the family, but I've got to sleep. I'm going to go to sleep during the day. I'm going to sleep at naps, and I'm going to keep myself just to get this task done. So I was able to compartmentalize it maybe a little bit. The other thing, though, is that if you look at the strategies of life, and these are strategies for war, strategies for surgeons, strategies for patients who are ill, we always look too close to ourselves. We should be looking with a further horizon.
Mm.
Keep saying, okay, I'm going to win this particular battle. I'll get this operation done. What's after that? How far do you go? And in terms of wars, I developed a notion when I wrote about it was instead of trying to win battles, what you should actually be trying to win is the peace.
Yeah.
Assuming this war is going to be over, we need to win what's going to come after it. And a lot of times we're a bit short-sighted on that. And for now, we're in trouble in Afghanistan. I think we'll win the peace in Afghanistan
Mm.
eventually, but it has to go through a longer phase. But for your own life, it's also the same. Think in a longer horizon than you're currently facing. So, residents who are stressing about getting their first job and things like that, so it only takes one job. So don't worry about it. And it honestly doesn't really matter where it is. Once you go there and you make a real serious effort to be a good surgeon. You'd be just amazed at the doors that open for
Yeah.
you, and you can do anything. Think way down the road for yourself.
So right now you're on another journey, which is the retirement journey. It's for some people it's a defined date. For others, it's never. And for many people, it's a period of transitional time. Um, Tell me about your thoughts about what's your thinking about when people should retire, and how did that influence, or how is that influencing your own decisions?
Um, yeah, very good point. I really don't know the answer, but I know what happened to me. I mean, I didn't really anticipate retirement, but I did start to define like what I was doing as a surgeon, and I did not want to be anything but the best. I had to be the best of everybody, the person that you would call when you're in trouble, and I'd have the wisdom to try and help people through and things like that. And I thought maybe I could play that type of a role uh, going forward. But the type of surgery I've done, all the different surgeries I've done, you're nothing unless you're doing it. So
Yeah.
you've got to be actually doing it. And I set a target for myself. Let's see if I'll go to 68, and I'll quit then. Then the pandemic came, and went through that, and I did a lot of uh, pandemic preparedness and uh, general surgery call, and we continued transplantation all through it. And I felt got to do that. Then when we started to emerge from the pandemic, I felt rather exhausted, and um, I had restricted my practice to transplantation, but just suddenly got the feeling this is not going to work, that the others are getting better. I'm not going to be the best. And I definitely don't want to be um, a burden to any team. So I kind of more or less precipitously quit at the age of 66. And uh, I haven't regretted it at all. Everybody's asked me, do you miss it? And I said, no, I think I've really done all I could. And I'm so delighted that I didn't disgrace myself, as I worried about all the way through my career, that I kept uh, doing what I thought was right for patients and doing it in the best manner that they could get at that time.
So you made that decision in the way that you describe. And amongst the interviews I've had, I've asked this question of several surgeons, obviously, and one surgean, it'll be coming out very shortly, so it's in his interview with Barry Salke, who is a legendary high BD surgeon, and he spent time making sure that he had a colleague watching him, so that like you, he didn't want to suddenly discover to his dismay that he'd lost it, if you like, and he was too long doing it. Another surgeon, in fact, if you watch the first interview, which was with Jeff Matthews in Chicago, he was saying that he thinks surgeons should do a voluntary cognitive and psychomotor testing from the age of 60, a non-punitive one, but just that sort of thing. I mean, there are multiple. You made the decision yourself. You didn't have.
Oh, I did try some of those other things. I wasn't worried about my technical uh,
Right.
abilities actually at all at this stage. What I was more worried about was decision making.
Yeah.
I've always believed that surgery is really decision making. It's not the the technical thing. For a long period of my surgery, and for a lot of my surgery, I actually was really just exposing things to be done, and a resident or a fellow would be
Yeah.
putting the stitches in and things. I found that more accurate because I would be able to watch it more
Yeah.
carefully.
Yeah.
And of course, I did rescues. If things weren't working out, I would do the rescue. But at the same time, a lot of the surgery, technical side of the surgery, wasn't a problem.
Yeah.
It's really about decisions. I had some difficult patients at the very end, young patients. I had one young COVID positive patient who had fulminant liver failure, unknown cause, but had been using drugs and things. And it was a real battle. I fought long and hard to get her transplant. And it was, there were many people saying you can't do it in a COVID patient. I said, well, not only will I do it in the COVID patient, but I'll take a COVID positive donor if you could give me one of those, because they weren't being used at the
Hmm.
time. And anyway, that battle wore me out. And I felt that, that here is an older person forcing this situation where all around me are thinking, has he gone off the wall altogether? Um, so I thought, actually, you reach a stage when if you have to be in if you worked with a team maybe and you let others fight those battles, um, then maybe you could be protected. But your age will always be brought against you
Yeah.
with respect to decision making. And surgery is a risky operation, a risky task that there will be failures. There has to be
Yeah.
failures. There wouldn't be
Hmm.
any risk if there were no failures. And you have to be able to review and say, I made all the right decisions. And that was the one that really drove me to
Hmm.
quit precipitously. To say,
So
I probably can't battle it anymore.
recently, or not, in some time ago, you were honored by Canada um, for your service to Canada and service to medicine, etc. And I'm sure it was an extraordinary experience for you, and um, enormous congratulations on that. But what I was going to ask you was, it's a measure of definition of success for people, particularly, as you know, in what would be the remnants of the colonial system, the honors system, et cetera, et cetera. But what I was going to ask you was, how do you define your success?
Well, I certainly did not define it as trying to achieve prizes or awards. But when they do arrive, I really felt quite emotional, and as much about the award, but it was really about the people who promoted me, who nominated me and went to bat for me. That I didn't know that was happening. I never knew that level of support was out there. Um, I think for me, I mean, there are all sorts of small successes where I was only out at breakfast with colleague in a diner, and a patient came up to me. Fortunately, I remembered her name, and because I have a trouble with names. I've always had it, and she was about 11 years from a Klatskin tumor that I removed. So, and I had remembered everything about her. So that was wonderful. I mean, that's a terrific feeling that you get of
Yeah.
say, oh, I'm so happy that happened. And I suppose as many of those experiences as you can have are measures of your
Yeah.
success.
Mhm.
And to have colleagues who thought that you did reasonably well, uh, that's also a measure of
And
success.
I guess in a similar vein, how would you like to be remembered, and how do you think you will be remembered?
Yeah, I I don't think you'd be remembered. So that's the simplest answer to that. Actually, what all through my career, I would do things in surgery, and I'd say Dennis Megan showed me this. It was Rafe Keane showed me a knot that he learned in Baltimore, and I tell people, "Oh, Dr. Keane or Mr. Keane showed me this knot. It's low profile. You know the way that people would get these PDS and nylon sutures, and then they'd make like a ponytail." Uh, and so I'd operate on an abscess, and I'd discover this thing about 3 inches long. I said, "What the heck is this? Why did you have to put so many knots in this?" Anyway, it was the first low profile knot. And I tell everybody, and I was still doing it right at the very end. And a few that tips and things. So if I would be remembered as I would prefer, it'd be somebody telling somebody, "Oh, McAlister showed me this or that." And that'd be enough. But I don't know.
Yes, well, as I often say to people, I remember somebody being asked. I mean, the late great Paddy Collins used to say, "None of us, there's nobody called Mozart in this room." So the only people that will remember you are your patients and your students, and I think that's a pretty accurate thing as you've just described. I mean, the two pieces of the equation, and I remember somebody being asked the same question many years ago, and his answer was, "I just would," which I also think is a reasonable answer. But the reality is, as you say, I mean, time moves on, and people's memories are short unless you have something special. So, do you have anything just in the last minute or two? Do you have a bucket list? And if you do, is there anything on it?
So I changed gears. Having stopped as a surgeon, I actually got the opportunity to join the Department of History in our university here, and I'm an adjunct professor. And I've been undertaking a combination of projects looking at history from maybe around the First World War and the early 20th century, mainly at doctors, and where there is an intersection between the medical and the political or general field of human experience. And then I started to apply a little bit to some of the problems that are being faced today, because I think surgeons actually have a couple of skills that are very useful for both decision makers in politics as well as historians. And that is, we have developed a power of observation where we try and get as much information in situations where it's not always available to make very astute decisions, guesses maybe, but decisions that have to be made. You have to make some sort of a decision, and surgeons are good at that. And we try to figure out where the forces are that are at play in a patient's care. You know, what type of patient do we have? What sort of illness? How much surgery can they tolerate? And how can I do a reconstruction? And all of these things are exactly the same when you look at the great events in the world. There are people who, it's not that history repeats itself, but the people are the same. And then if you could figure out the forces that are at play, you can actually understand a little more about it.
So
it happened to me in Iraq once. We were there when ISIS was carrying on, and the special forces were with us in the medical area, and their intelligence was saying that they won't move down south until after Christmas. But I had already found out that the what was called the PML, the Popular Mobilization, I thought PMF, Popular Mobilization, had already moved. They were the Iran-backed thing. And I don't know how I knew that. It was maybe from some other conversation. I said, no, I don't think so. They're going on Tuesday. And that's exactly what happened. And they all came back to me and said, how did you know that? And it's kind of obvious just looking at the forces that are at play. So we ended up doing a mobile medical surgical unit to address that particular activity that happens.
Sometimes important to listen to all the voices around you. So Vivian, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you for the last short time. It's been a fascinating story with many extraordinary experiences and a life of great achievement. And I think you are a great role model for any aspiring surgeon. So I'm very grateful to you for spending the time, and I'm sure that this conversation, when it appears to the assembled millions of the YouTube channel, will be a very popular viewing. So thank you so very much indeed.
Thank you, John. So I have one question for you.
Yes, sir.
Who's doing your interview?
Well, it's very interesting, actually. You are, I think, the fourth person to ask me that question. Right. And my continuing answer is, as yet, that's undecided.